And then I saw a YouTube video about this virtual production app called JetSet that was an iPhone app with like real-time preview of a scene. It was doing all of your motion tracking. It was calibrated to your camera. So all of that, data from the phone matches the footage from your camera. We knew in 3D space where this boom pole, this flying drone robot would be, so that when I put it into the 3D scene, it was in the correct location with the correct movements. And we had a light on that boom pole, so all of that light interaction with the actor, it just matched up perfectly. The dailies were post-viz, where we could see, our actor in a space. Obviously, it's, the rough version of it, but we're not watching, an actor in a sea of green. We're seeing the context of the scene.
Hello and welcome to the VFX Artist Podcast. This week we have Alden Peters and we're going to talk mostly about virtual production on a budget. So first of all, Alden, tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do and how you got into it.
For sure. Thank you for having me. My name's Alden Peters. I'm a director, writer, and VFX artist. I'm based in Los Angeles now, but I was in New York City for 12 years. I went to film school at NYU Tisch, but I started learning like After Effects as a teenager, watching Video Copilot, videocopilot.net tutorials, and then, did community college in Seattle where I'm from, and then was lucky enough to go transfer to NYU. While I was there and in New York, I did a lot of like documentary and news media jobs, most of it working in like motion graphics and stuff. But I learned how to be, like a scrappy, get it done with no resources kind of a mentality. And I was making like independent films on the side. So I did a feature documentary called Coming Out, which did a, international film festival run and won some audience and grand jury awards. And they got this distribution deal. So it was, you can watch it on Amazon Prime or Tubi. After that, I did a short comedy called Femme, which has Stephanie Hsu from Everything Everywhere All at Once. It was Rachel Brosnahan from Marvelous Mrs. Maisel and the upcoming Superman was the executive producer. And it also has like Johnny Sibley, who has a part in Hacks. If you're a Broadway person, Derek Klena, who is just Tony nominated for Jagged Little Pill. And I think he's playing Fiyero right now in Wicked on Broadway, and also Aja from RuPaul's Drag Race. So it was like this crazy, like stacked cast of people, like right before everyone's careers took off. And that one played, at a bunch of film festivals, and you can watch it on YouTube or on a streaming service called Reverie. And while I was doing this, I had the day job at the side doing motion graphics. And like once upon a time, if you were an editor who knew After Effects, you were like a unicorn. And eventually or slowly that was becoming the norm, where it was like, you need to have these additional skill sets to get the job. And so I was like, I need to learn 3D to stay competitive. So I started watching tutorials and I started learning Blender because it was free. And as I was doing that, I realized like, oh, I think I can now try to push myself to make the type of film that I always wanted to make, that teenage me learning from Andrew Kramer dreamed of, like something like some sort of sci-fi project with big visual effects, but how, I could never figure out how to do that with like, a small, scrappy, independent production. And the answer was to do it myself. And so that turned into this project called Friends of Sophia, which is this short film. It's streaming on Dust on YouTube, and it stars Nana Visitor from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And it's just this big, colorful cyberpunk world that I wrote and directed and did all the VFX. But it took me like 2 years to finish all the VFX. So many times on set, I would say, no, I'll fix it in post. So this is fine. And, it premiered in London at BFI Flair and, won a couple like awards. But I was like, wow, this, it took so long to do this level of visual effects. And, the team that we had, it was the biggest like production that I had run. And I was like, to scale this up would still be prohibitively expensive. And then I saw a YouTube video about this virtual production app called JetSet that was an iPhone app with like real-time preview of a scene. It was doing all of your motion tracking. It was calibrated to your camera. So all of that, data from the phone matches the footage from your camera. And it kind of like builds out you run it through a desktop component called AutoShot, and it dropped your footage as an image plane, as an EXR sequence in 3D space in your 3D scene. So it kind of took that first chunk of the VFX process, which is, basically where you're reverse engineering what happened on set, like doing all of your match moving and stuff like that. And just kind of like made that go super fast because all that data was captured. And I was like, I want to try all this because it's on an iPhone app, not like a massively expensive LED wall. And so with Lightcraft Support, they're the company that does the app. We made a 7-episode series that takes place in that same Friends of Sophia world. And it's called Friends of Sophia Tidbits and Bites. It's all on YouTube. We just finished it not that long ago. And there's also over an hour of like behind the scenes content that I put together of like how we pulled it off and different, like, not just using the app for virtual production, but also using like another instance of the app to do some object tracking in 3D space because it's all based on the same origin points and stuff, and how that, went into that post process. And the whole project from start to finish, it lasted 8 months, which is remarkably faster than the short that we did. And the run times are about 23 minutes and 18 minutes respectively. So it was like kind of comparable run times. And just happened so much faster. So I don't know, to summarize it all, it's like, visual effects has always been like a core part of my process. It's how I was learning how to do After Effects and make people fly and try to make lightsaber effects, as I was also learning how to tell a story cinematically. And so even now I'm like mocking up VFX as I'm writing a script. And it's sort of this holistic creative process for me that sort of comes from this, scrappy mentality of like, how can I make this project happen on my own without needing to ask for someone's permission? And a lot of the time for me, that's just been learning how to, do it myself or learn as much as I can myself without having to, rely too much on the budget to build out these big teams. And so virtual production has been like the current forefront of that process.
Actually, what got me interested in, I found the Lightcraft and JetSet, and then I found your Tidbits and Bites and the making of. And I'd just come off, working on Walking with Dinosaurs, which is kind of the opposite end of, it's a big production, BBC PBS, and we had, multiple supervisors. I was supervising 2 of the shoots, and which is why, for listeners on the podcast, I haven't recorded an episode for a long time. But then, as you say, we had a lot of this time where you had no creatures, and then by the time you've just got grayscale dinosaurs and you can show the directors and they can start working with the animation, a certain amount of time has passed.
Mm-hmm.
And what I thought was interesting about your process, and obviously it might be that on a bigger production, it needs some changes, but you're already in a kind of quite a nice post-viz place and a good directing space.
Mm-hmm.
So even if those effects on a bigger production might go back and have like more artists work on them, they wouldn't just be, starting from nothing. So you almost like you've got a post-viz, but you've kind of got post-viz almost like rushes, which I thought was really fascinating from where you were at. And also, like, I thought it was quite funny that you did a Friends of Sophia and Tidbits and Bites. If anyone's not seen them, I mean, when everyone says cyberpunk world, they're usually the same sort of dystopian kind of thing. This is about people that love robots, and I mean like really, really love robots, to the point they're actually robosexual, and even Tidbits and Bites is maybe a little bit more hardcore in the sense of, in Friends of Sophia the robots are quite humanoid, whereas in Tidbits and Bites we have a very robotic
big metal robot, 3D animated. One of the main characters is like this big 3D animated military bot that's 7 feet tall.
Yeah, so it's a story you're not used to seeing, and it's definitely fun. And yeah, the animation. This is also, so let's break it down a little bit. So the actual software. So it's got an app on an iPhone, but it's not just an iPhone app. It's part of a suite essentially, working alongside other software. So you're working in Blender, and you could work in Unreal.
Yeah.
I've seen people have used it, connected it with Houdini, so it's not unique to one software. And then also with the compositing apps, you're using After Effects, but you could use Nuke or you could use Fusion or whatever.
100%.
So, and then the pricing also, so there's a free version, which is just on the iPhone. And that's kind of good for playing around and checking if it will work. So I did some testing with that on the, annoyingly, I'm an Android. It's the first time I've been annoyed that I'm an Android user.
Oh, no, yeah.
But I borrowed the company iPad and set it up and put one of the dinosaurs in. And I was like, oh, I can actually put this in my garden. I can't show any of this because these aren't my assets or anything. But it's quite interesting. I was like, in my garden and it's
Mhm.
there, and okay, you could then animate it from there. And also you can see how big it is, and the DOP can see what they're looking at, and they can see if like, oh, maybe that's not where I've focused the camera. So, we should move. I mean, we were using big sticks with plastic heads, and you could combine it with that.
Mhm.
And in fact, there's a really interesting one of the episodes of your making of, you have a kind of more advanced version of our blue heads on sticks, in that you have an iPhone on a stick. So you have another iPhone on another. So you have the iPhone that is on a camera rig. So in the
Mhm.
full version, the cine version, you have your camera and then a physical rig that you bought that is attaching the iPhone to your camera like a witness cam.
Mhm.
And then as you say, you're calibrating the two together so that you're recording your iPhone footage, and then you're able to use your footage you're using, I think, the Blackmagic.
Mhm.
Is that right? But it could be any camera.
Yeah, it's like how it works is like just like a rundown of this app called JetSet. It's an iPhone app called JetSet, and it's only on an iPhone because it uses Apple's AR kit for the motion tracking. And it's a desktop software called AutoShot. And essentially you can drop in a 3D scene. So it's, a USDZ file or a Gaussian splat that you put into the phone. You show the phone the floor, so it kind of gets a sense of like space. You drop an origin point, and then suddenly you can see this scene in your phone, move it around like augmented reality. And you can record takes with the app and then bring that into editing software or something. And then there's like a pro tier, I think, that allows you to record in like 4K. And then there's the cine tier, which allows for hooking that up to a camera. So you would have your iPhone attached to your camera rig, like locked off. They're connected. They use like an Axon CMO device, so HDMI or SDI, that basically it takes the HDMI SDI out from your cinema camera, runs it through Axon so it can go into either the USB-C or the Thunderbolt port of the iPhone. And so what that is doing is you pull up this calibration process that goes fast, that is looking at the feed from both your cinema camera and the iPhone, and you get some reference frames, and it'll calculate the offset of these two cameras. So as the iPhone is doing all of this motion tracking, all that data is being offset so it matches your cinema camera, so it's matching your footage that you're shooting. And currently you can also do a full called cine compositing, where you can actually see your camera feed within the app itself. So it's basically a monitor that has, your 3D scene visible. So you can shoot, in front of a green screen or something. You don't need that LED wall, but you can see what your shot is. And where it becomes really powerful is exactly like what you're saying when you're looking at this big dinosaur. It's like when you can see what is there and you can see the scale of how your shot is composed, it just changed how we were from the first episode to the last episode. It just fundamentally changed how we were shooting these VFX shots, because you can do these really intricate camera moves because you know what's going to be there. And even though the USDZ scene within the iPhone app is like a little bit of a lower res, low poly count, and some of the textures aren't like super high res, just to get it to be running real time in the phone, you're seeing, what's going to be there. It's also because of the LiDAR scanner, it knows how far away your actor is. If there's something in your 3D scene that would be actually in front of where your actor is, it'll obscure them. So you can like record from behind a corner or something like that. And it felt like we were shooting on location when you're just looking in this iPhone monitor, essentially, rather than, getting this on a green screen. And when you look at the raw footage, our actor is looking at a light stand that is the stand-in for this, as a stand-in for this robot. And so what we did was we used a second iPhone on like a boom pole. We set the same origin points to the version that's attached to our cinema camera and the version on the boom pole. And so because they have the same reference origin point, we knew in 3D space where this boom pole, this flying drone robot, would be, so that when I put it into the 3D scene, it was in the correct location with the correct movements. And we had a light on that boom pole. So all of that light interaction with the actor, it just matched up perfectly without all of the, the guesswork of like, oh, I need to move this in Z space and X space and Y space just a little bit to like get all that stuff to line up.
So could you preview the robot in real time while you were there?
Yeah, so what I did is like you can drop in like there's animations in there too. So
it would move with your boom pole. Yeah.
No, so that component of it wasn't set up when we were shooting. I know now there are object locator, so you can move objects within your scene. So like, if you need to fly a wall out or something like that for your angle. As far as that working in real time, I don't know if that is possible yet with, with the JetSet component. But the real beauty, I think, is then when you run this through AutoShot, which is a desktop component, it basically is taking all of that data from your phone. You point, here's the footage that we shot, here's proxies, here is the take that it is, synced with from the phone, here's the app I want to open it with, the program, whether it's Blender or Unreal. And here's that specific project file. And here's like the frames from that shot I want to use. It runs all of that through AutoShot. It'll open up for me, Blender project with my scene. My footage is in a 3D plane, keyed out in 3D space, where that actor really was within the 3D scene that we had previewed in the app. So it basically goes from, getting through a day's shoot, I don't know, maybe took an hour, to run everything through. So it's like you were saying, it's like the dailies were post-viz, where we could see, our actor in a space. Obviously, it's, the rough version of it, but we're not watching, an actor in a sea of green. We're seeing the context of the scene. As we edit things together, we can see what the backgrounds are going to be. And then we would do the regular post, VFX process of, getting everything up to final pixel. But having that, shooting with that intention because we could see it in real time, and then having that post-viz so quickly it just sped up the whole process, and is why I'm such a fan of JetSet and the app. And even though it sounds like I'm a, salesperson for them, I am not. I just enjoyed it so much as a tool. It just unlocked so much potential for me.
Brilliant. What was the learning curve like on setting this up for you?
The learning curve wasn't too bad. I started with the free version, and where in the free version, you can only use the iPhone camera. I think it's currently, because of ARKit in the iPhone, you can only record stuff in 30 frames per second, but it's just using your iPhone camera for, the 3D scene or whatever. So instead of having the sync to the cinema camera, I think the learning curve that it took me a little bit of time was to figure out how big of a scene can you put in this app before things start crashing or it just is too much for real time. And then how can I get that scene, because with the USDZ file, it's just your material preview of your scene. So all the lighting and all the, the vibe of the scene that you're going for. And in this Friends of Sophia world, it's super bright, saturated colors coming from all directions. But then our real-time background that we're looking at is just a low res material preview. So figuring out how to either bring in a Gaussian splat so that I can see, that lighting baked in, or baking the lighting into the materials in general, and sort of that sort of workflow. And I think I didn't really figure out, I preferred having the mesh to the Gaussian splat, just because the Gaussian splats had to be decimated. Well, also my Gaussian splats were based on a 3D environment. So it wasn't, from a LiDAR scanner or something that had a ton of detail. So it was kind of a little more of a painterly effect of what we were looking at. And sometimes, the splats would, obscure our actor or the robot character that's in there. Whereas the mesh detail, the mesh detail was much more refined. So things like railings or something, I would much prefer to have a mesh rather than kind of a messy Gaussian splat. Yeah. And so it wasn't until we just did at an event, we were doing a live preview with them. And so I had BJ, who plays Tidbits, come in, and we basically recorded another little scene where I baked all the lighting into the materials. And then that was the best of both worlds, because we had a really low poly mesh environment that played very nicely with the app. And also you can see the direction of the lighting. So as we were lighting our actor, we could see the context of where all those lights were actually coming from within the scene. I think, so that was the biggest for me was how do I, because I hadn't done any kind of virtual production or real-time stuff before. I haven't needed to learn Unreal Engine because I would have always done my VFX in post and I was faster in Blender. It's the same reason why I use After Effects, though I'm currently trying to learn Fusion. It's just because I can do things faster. And so, that kind of learning curve of how do I get the scene to play nice? My first one was massive corridor environment with all this geometry, and I kept crashing the app. And I realized I don't need that mesh detail when it's way off in the distance. So I can, have that be an image plane and only need the mesh detail for these closer environments and stuff. The other learning curve, I think, was some of the, like, it did really well. I think in like 7 episodes, it's probably like 25-ish to 30 shots per episode. There were really only 2 or 3 where the tracking didn't work and needed, like, there's some slipping, or the app was overheating a little bit, so like some of the thing was off. So how to fix all of that tracking, find all that data was a little bit of a learning curve. But AutoShot, the desktop component, also generates all of these scripts for like things like Synthesize that incorporates all the tracking data that it does have. Also, the app, you do a 3D scan of your set as well. So you have the reference of where, if you had an Apple box where that was supposed to be a terminal that they're pressing a button on, you have that context in your Blender scene as well. So it takes that mesh, the tracking data, and it basically, you start refining that data rather than needing to do a whole track from the beginning. And some of that was a learning curve for me, just because I wasn't as familiar with all of the scripts that it needed to run for all of these things. Making Gaussian splats was a learning curve for me as well. But I would say that's about it. It felt very natural to me to, it was just exciting to see the scene in real time. And so I think that my excitement overruled any of the like learning curves, because it was just like, I was very motivated to, figure this out to use this tool.
No, that's brilliant. I mean, yeah, a lot of these are new workflows. I mean, Gaussian splats are fairly new, even Unreal. I mean, now it's coming into sort of Final Pixel for production. And so everyone is sort of figuring some of these things out. And I think one of the nice things about these kind of small, indie, scrappy productions, you can test stuff that you'd be a bit too risk averse on a big production, because you're like, well, I can't, if this doesn't work, it kind of, and I think that's why I thought this was a fascinating, topic. Because I like the fact that, you've gone, right, okay, I'm just going to try it. This is totally new. Doesn't look like anyone's, and more people are doing some shots, but I think you're one of the first to do an actual show on it. And obviously they've sponsored you to help get that out, which is really cool. And I also like the fact that the other question I wanted to ask actually was about the phone itself. So presumably this isn't just your phone. You're not making calls between takes, or, this phone is now with the camera department, essentially. Did you have to buy a separate phone just for running the app, or just say, no one can call me?
So first 2 episodes that we shot, I used my phone. So my iPhone that I'm taking calls, that thing was on airplane mode and attached to the camera, and I had no phone for the day, because the only like really hiccup with that is like the phone needs to stay mounted on the camera. When you do that calibration, you can't move the iPhone, because then that calibration data is off. So the first 2 episodes, I really was like, I want to do this myself so that I know the whole process. And like a couple of the folks that we had on set, worked with Lightcraft and knew the ins and outs more than I did. And they also had like a phone in their studio. So the other episodes after that, we used their phone. There was just like a studio phone that they had that, they were using JetSet with. But the first 2, it was just my poor little iPhone 13 that's had a screen replacement because I dropped it too many times, and the Face ID doesn't work, and like that's also coincidentally I think why it was more prone to crashing when it was my phone, and we never had a crashing issue once we moved on to the phone that was solely used for that. But we did both, and you could do both as well, depending on what kind of production you're trying to run. If you're doing something small and scrappy, use your own phone and play with it. If you are able to have that second phone and treat it like a camera department monitor kind of tool, or VFX soup department kind of tool, maybe it's better to have that
absolutely
stay separate.
And you had did you have to have any sort of special cooling or anything like that? They do seem to recommend this on
there. So there's just like a fan that you like, magnetic fan you put on the phones. The app is running the iPhone good. It is taking advantage of everything the phone can do. And so the phone gets really, really hot. And the hotter that the phone gets, that's when there starts to be a degradation in the tracking data. And so having that, part of that Axun Simu device that is running the camera feed, it's also power for the iPhone and power for a fan as well. Or you could, route that power from a different battery source if you needed to. But yeah, you want to make sure the phone is constantly powered so that it's not draining that battery and then need to cool it down as well. And interestingly enough, I went to NAB with them in Las Vegas a little bit ago, and I was at one of their booths, and a lot of people thought that the fan attached to the phone was JetSet. They thought that was the camera tracking device, and we're like, no, it's using the iPhone. That's just to keep the fan cool, or the
because the
phone
fan
cool.
looks bigger and more impressive than the actual phone. Yeah,
exactly.
That's brilliant. So once you brought the data in, so I guess whether you're going to do some extra tracking kind of depends on the kind of shot, right? So you've got a lot of, shots like the 2 shots we're looking at in the podcast now, it could be more forgiving, and probably the tracking data from JetSet is going to be fine. And it's when you've got them, but you've got shots where they're walking along the corridor and walking around the floor. They're climbing up ladders and doing all kinds of, they climb a ladder and they go to the top of, to see this vista of the city. So they climb to this vantage point and they sit on this, it's a bit like the picnic shot.
Yep.
I don't know if that was an inspiration there, but
sure.
The New York skyscraper construction workers doing their having their lunch break, and so all of that is done, is tracked to the app. So that's where you're presumably doing some tracking in post as well to just lock that down a little bit.
No, so it was really interesting because, as we were doing the series, and we did it like one at a time. So we would shoot one, do the whole edit, post it, shoot the next one. We kind of went, and Elliot and Bill at Lightcraft, who as an aside are just wonderful people, and they care so much about the creatives using their product. And it's been, and part of why I'm such a fan, obviously, of them is and JetSet is them itself. So wonderful collaborators, kind of like you mentioned. Friends of Sophia World is, it's different, a little bit. And they were just fiercely supportive and never asked me to change any content or if we're going to use this as an example for our company, maybe could you change these jokes? Nothing like that. They've just have been super supportive to allow me to tell the kind of story I wanted to tell. And so as we we're doing the shoot, each episode, Elliot would be like, maybe we can look at this for the BTS breakdown. And there was one where he was like, can you do some tracking refinement? And I was like, yeah, of course, because we have some shots where we see their feet on the floor. And obviously that contact point is where you're going to see, the slipping. All the medium shots, if there's I think the accuracy they say is that it's within a centimeter. And so with a lot of the medium shots, you're not noticing any kind of centimeter drift, especially as we're shooting handheld. But with the feet, you would notice that drift. And then on that day, everything turned out perfectly. No slippage. It was perfect. And I had to go find a different shot from a different episode to do the tutorial with because everything worked well. And same with that ladder. That was one where we had a ladder, draped a green screen over it. And I was just like, this is going to be my nightmare when I get into post. And that track worked perfectly. I had to rotoscope that shot to death, obviously, because I fully replaced the ladder with, part of the 3D set. But the tracking, perfect on that one. All of the, on this lookout and plank, we filmed our actor on a piece of scaffolding on our green screen, which I then rotoed out. But all of that tracking, perfect. And so it was just sort of hit or miss sometimes where a shot would drift a little bit, but then sometimes they were we're going to see their feet and they're going to be walking, and the data showed up beautifully. So that's where you're more likely to notice it. And some of that adjustment you would need to do to get that sub-pixel accurate tracking data. That's when running it through Synthesize with their scripts and all that kind of stuff would be helpful. But when I needed to do a tutorial about it, JetSet worked perfectly for me.
No, that's funny that it actually worked so well that you had to struggle to do the tutorial you needed to do. This is a kind of this, you can sort of see these advances because when you see an app, I had an app on a really old phone. It was a Symbian phone, if you even know what Symbian is. It was Nokia's attempt to enter the smartphone world, and they made their own OS, then they went bankrupt. But it had this app where you could put in some VFX things, like a satellite would fall down and it would track it into the machine. And this was,
whoa, a while ago.
This was 2000 maybe. So, and I was always like, well, this is great. Okay, it's not perfect, but why is it when we're tracking stuff for VFX, we're using technology that's much older than that? It's basically just a fancier version of Buju. And, all of this stuff that you're getting from cameras is not filtering through. Why are we, and it's good to see that now you can sort of see how those connections are being made, and you're still able to bring in tools like Synthesize and do finesse the tracking to to the degree that you might need if you're going to watch it on a big cinema screen,
Mhm.
but you're not necessarily having to start completely from scratch, and you are able to leverage some of this tech and some of this kind of cool stuff.
You have no idea how many times I have just lamented, like, how come when I'm doing tracking something in Blender, it's this whole long process, but my phone can do this, like, do an okay job in real time, tracking a face for like a, Snapchat or Instagram or TikTok filter kind of thing. And it's like, sure, that's obviously not a sub-pixel accurate track that's going to hold up on a big screen, but it's like, it's doing something okay. And how come when I have to do it for real, I have to start from scratch? So exactly what you're saying, it does feel like this is an example of like where we're starting with what this phone can do and then, improving it from there rather than starting from these old tools from scratch.
How do you think you would find this if you were to use it not in a studio environment? So if you were to take it out and do something that was all in the exterior. So say you had not a digital environment, you had tidbits and bytes, but you took them out into real streets and you wanted to just have the CG character. How do you think it would hold up in that sort of scenario?
What a great question. So I've been talking about Lightcraft about like, let's do this. Let's do tests of exactly this because I think Tidbits and Bytes I think we did a really good job of exploring the green screen workflow. If you're going to be shooting in an environment that is, you know, a VFX environment, a sci-fi environment that we don't really have, um, and we need to do green screen, here's all the ways that that can work. But that is a question that I have because I think about this for other purposes too. Like, what about a set extension? What about where, you actually want to film in an alleyway and maybe just up above the alleyway is where you see this sci-fi city. So like, going in, doing a scan of that environment, bring it into Blender, doing the set extension, and then having just that set extension in the app so you can still see in real time. You have your actors in front of a real space. You can, pan down from this big sci-fi vista and you can merge these two things together and still get all of that tracking data. Another, use case is like, what about an environment where you can't get a film crew in there? So, thinking about like, if you're shooting something a period piece and the only train that's period accurate is in a transportation museum and, can't get in there for a week with a film crew, can you go in and, get like high res 3D scans of the environment and then use JetSet to film that after the fact? Can you, if you're doing a genre thing like a sci-fi piece, can you get away with production designing just the kind of immediate vicinity around your actor and then using digital, environment and sets beyond that? And I think with Tidbits and Bytes, what I found was where the interior apartment scenes are where the shots maybe don't hold up the best because what a person in a room looks like. You get away with so much when it's, that overhang shot looking at this big vista. But in that environment, it's like, okay, if we were to like have a very simple apartment we could be shooting in, and I could still add the sci-fi apartment elements to the walls and all that stuff, but I have the mesh of the space we were shooting in, the tracking data from the phone, and a 3D scan of that environment, I can really accurately and quickly add all of those extensions without needing to, start with my footage, do my tracking, figuring out, okay, am I going to comp a 3D asset and just track, do some planar tracking and do it there? Is it going to be a 3D track because we have all that stuff is kind of taken care of for me. And those are really exciting things that I want to test out because I think that beyond a big sci-fi use case, it's like this is really helpful for the scrappy indie production that doesn't have the budget to necessarily like go shoot in certain spaces or could production design a whole city street, but could get away with seeing no cars in your shot in this area. And then the rest can be like a VFX kind of shot.
I mean, that's a big thing. That's used in even the bigger movies. Encounter that same issue. If they want something that's set on Air Force One or Buckingham Palace, or these kind of things happen, you can't go in there. Or the Vatican. There's certain places you can't just take over. And so, like lots of films that have used those locations, they have done exactly that. I mean, obviously they've done it on a bigger scale. It's interesting that you can potentially expedite that workflow and do it much faster. And again, the scrappy production is the obvious example, but having a kind of very quick post-viz in your rushes,
Mm-hmm.
and then having a director on a bigger budget able to take that to a post house and go, like, like, so this is the edit. Because the big problem with the bigger productions is actually getting a locked edit. When, I mean, not so much environments, but especially when it's characters, part of the performance or one part is not in the shot. How can an editor, the editors are being asked to lock the cut, but how can they really lock the cut when they don't have, 50% of the performance there? So it's really interesting what this can entail and what sort of stuff this can. The use cases are enormous. I mean, from a practical point of view, you have, it's quite a lightweight kit even when you're watching it on a laptop. So you have to connect via Wi-Fi, or do you need?
Yeah, so the phone, the desktop app uses the IP address from the phone, so they're both on the same Wi-Fi network. And you need the computer, whether it's a laptop or a desktop, if you're like doing something in the apartment, like here, I just use my desktop, but it's like what it's doing is you need that for the lens calibration. So you get those reference frames within the iPhone app, but then it pushes all that data to the desktop app to actually do the number crunching and calculate that offset and then send that data back to the phone. If you have like a time code sync between your iPhone and your camera, then that is used to sync up, the iPhone data takes and your camera takes later. If you don't, you also need this like QR code slate. So like an iPad or something that's running AutoShot that is going to flash a QR code, which is how AutoShot will figure out, the sync between those two shots. But if you have the time code, you don't need it. So you really only need the computer on your production day to do that lens calibration. You could be sending some shots, in your break or setup times through AutoShot and run them through and like open something up in Blender. So we would do that occasionally too, but you don't have to. So it could be, it depends on the needs of your production and how much of that, back and forth you want to do. And sometimes you might want to have that computer there. You might need to change something in your environment. And unlike obviously having Unreal on an LED screen where you can like adjust things in real time, you would need to do that in Blender, export your USDZ file and push that to the app to get that visible. So there is, that little hiccup in the workflow
But you
process
could
if
push
you
it.
want.
You could push that from Unreal as well. So that
Oh
could
yeah,
also.
for sure, for sure.
And you could also you could be watching a scene in Unreal, I believe, with the camera data.
Yes, so they also have, we didn't do it on Tidbits and Bytes, but I know at NEB they had this setup where it's running through Ximetry. So it's taking, there's a little bit of like, I want to say it's like maybe like a 3 to 5 frame delay, but you can run what your JetSet through Ximetry so you can actually see your scene in Unreal with that proper lighting, with your actor in there, much more like that kind of real time. So like if you had a client on set or you needed somebody who couldn't trust the process of what you're seeing in the app itself, you can get a much more refined preview there. The only thing is, as you're shooting, you wouldn't want to look at that monitor because of the slight delay to do that round trip, but it's great for seeing what that shot is going to look
like. Even setting up lighting, I mean, one of the reasons when green screen shots look false is usually not the key, but it's 9 times out of 10 it's just the lighting does not match, because whatever was decided on the day in the studio, maybe it's studio lighting and then it's like meant to be daylight or whatever. But the more you have the ability to say, oh no, this is the lighting, DOP can match that, rather than thinking, oh, it's a green screen shot, light it like a green screen and
exactly.
looking very studio lit. And so you can do all of that connection via wires as well if you didn't have Wi-Fi, if you were like out in a forest or something like that, or on a beach, or would you need Wi-Fi?
That's a good question that I don't know the answer to. I think that's that tech, especially with like the Ximetry and running it through that. There's like other folks at Lightcraft I would lean on to figure those things out. But that is exactly why I wanted to do those other tests too, because it's like, I have this other script and like part of it takes place on a beach. And I'm like, okay, can I use JetSet on a beach? Where is my hiccup there? If there is one, do I need to, if we've got a small team on a secluded location, do I have to run my computer from, do I have to like tether to my phone and like do that? Is that enough just to like get the signal just to run that data? I'm not sure where those limitations are, but I'm excited to find out because that's exactly that has been on my mind.
Yeah, no, this is the first thing I was looking at when I was watching the videos. Okay, Wi-Fi, great, studio, take it out of studio. What happens? Does it fall over? Can you do it? So yeah, this has been brilliant. So what, I guess, what can you tell us about your next project? What's the plan there? Is that still in the same world, or is this something completely different?
I'm working on two. So when I finished Friends of Sophia the short, I was like, okay, a feature is not going to work because it was going to be too like it was going to be too expensive. And there was like and I was like, I don't think I could raise that kind of money or get the kind of support that I would need to make this project work. And then we did Tidbits and Bytes. And suddenly I'm like, a feature's back on the table because if we did Tidbits and Bytes with a crew of 6 people, now that's a production we could scale up and keep, our budget down. And so I also loved BJ Miner, who plays Tidbits, was wonderful to work with. And honestly, I would credit as like the reason the series works is BJ's work as an actor, because they're looking at a light stand, and the audio of Bytes, the robot's line, is coming from JetSet the app. So there's like an animation playing in the app, and the lines are doing, and we can see that. But when BJ's on set, they're looking at a light stand and they're just hearing this like, and it's usually me, doing scratch audio for Bytes' lines. And the amount of like humanity and emotion and like honesty that BJ conveys was a dream. And so I was like, okay, I did have like a draft of a feature before that was based on the short. And I was like, I need to start over and, put BJ front and center, first of all. And now knowing what we can achieve, scaling that up. So I'm working on that script, and I also have another feature that's kind of a much more budget conscious kind of project, but is not in the same world. It is much more grounded in our world, but there are these like VFX elements and shots and sequences that JetSet is going to make possible and feasible with a small modest kind of team.
That the idea, I mean, the classic example of the small scrappy VFX movie is Monsters. Gareth Edwards' Monsters. If you've seen that a few years ago, I say a few years ago, it's quite a long time ago. But the idea of a indie VFX artist who shot a thing with 4 or 5 people and a relatively small budget, but this is a similar kind of concept, and the idea that you've got, I think it's good that you have a couple of projects on the go, because I think would you advise that always for filmmakers to always have more than one possible project? Because
I think
if
so.
one stalls, you can keep the other one going.
Exactly. I've always found, and this is just part of my creative process, is like I enjoy working on 2 things at once, because it's really nice to, when you have a draft and you're like, I need a minute to, refresh myself before revising it, boom, I can bounce to another project. If I'm procrastinating or, it's just like not happening today, I have another project I can work on. And it's like being able to procrastinate a project with another project, I appreciate as a creative, but I also think, practically speaking, being able to have options that you can achieve. And like in this case, the Friends of Sophia project is still, the feature is a more ambitious project because it is the cyberpunk world. And when every part of that world has to be built in a computer and needs to be a VFX shot, that even, with a small scrappy team, that's still a ton of work and takes either a ton of time, or then we do have to build out more of a VFX team instead of it just being me, which obviously is more of a budget. But this other one is like much more like a very small indie feature. And it's, with a scalpel using visual effects in certain moments. And so depending on which one of these projects takes off, or like, happens, gets its funding, gets the team together first, it's nice to be able to have those options rather than, being stuck to one.
So everything sounds really cool. Were there any things that you would like to see improved in the workflow with the virtual production that you've been, based on your experience on Tidbits and Bytes?
Yeah, I think that there's like been, incremental progress with the app as they like update things. And like, I was obviously very privileged to be able to be working with them directly. So there would be like little things like, they've been doing test shots, but when you have a full project as you know, like you have multiple VFX shots in your edit that come from the same take. But when I was running it through AutoShot, it was just renaming, it would like overwrite files because it was naming it the same. So I messaged them, this is happening. Boom, they have a new feature in AutoShot where you can name your VFX shot. So that would stop happening. And like little things like that are really helpful. Also, if anyone listening is going to be using JetSet, reach out to them because they, like I mentioned, Elliot and Bill, like they care about creatives and how we are using JetSet, and any kind of feedback or conversation they're super open to. And so I think that those changes will, I think that there's, eventually going to be probably some type of smoother way to get from your scene, whether it's in Unreal or Blender, and getting it into the app. So that sort of like process of like, the exports, and then it's also using like an iCloud folder to drop it in. Like maybe there's a way to do more of this from your computer, more control out of the iPhone app, and maybe from a separate computer or iPad or something, so you don't have to be using the iPhone to do some of this stuff. But those are small like quality of life improvements. I think in the big picture though, I'm excited that like something like virtual production or a tool like this is available to a filmmaker like me or other filmmakers that are, working independently, working with low budgets, trying to make a passion project, trying to, make that project that they've always wanted to make, but don't have the resources necessarily for a full studio size type of thing. That's really exciting. Where this goes in like the bigger picture, and like, you've kind of hinted at it, throughout, and I would agree that like this works really well for small teams. How does an app like JetSet work on a bigger project, right? Suddenly every one of those little hiccups along the way, the pressure is a lot more extreme when you're having a project with a bigger budget, and that time is money. And if you have a 10-minute delay because of some technical issue, that is a failure of that system, on a bigger kind of level of production. Whereas, on a small thing, 10 minutes, everything's a disaster on a small thing. So we're always trying to troubleshoot throughout the day. Like there's never like, nothing is going like perfectly well because it is a scrappier type of thing. So I'm curious to see like where those two things start to merge. How, when you have tools like this, what does this mean for like younger up and coming people, even younger than I am and earlier in my career than they are, where, I feel like my career is just getting started. But, what about the teenager that's right now watching a tutorial at home like I was? What are they going to be able to do with this kind of tool? What does the whole VFX industry even look like in the next 5 to 10 years? It's certainly going to look different than the one that existed 5 or 10 years ago. And so like, those are like the questions that are both existentially terrifying and also really exciting, to know that there's little ways to have fun opportunities that weren't possible before. And JetSet's an example of that. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I see things going. And I think for me, the JetSet workflow, the AutoShot workflow, it just folded into my workflow so perfectly. And I maybe am more of an anomaly than for some reason. Like maybe it just happened to be that this fell into my workflow really, really well. So, but maybe somebody else is like, they're feeling the hiccups and the pinch points and the snags here and there in the workflow. And I'd be very curious to see what those are. I think the more I was on a shoot that was using it, and the more people you have, the more hiccups there are. When everything is in, like when I built everything in the app, when I am going to be doing the VFX, when I wrote and am directing the thing, it's a pretty seamless system. Once you have somebody who's built the environments, somebody who is your VFX supervisor, somebody who is running the virtual production, is like your virtual production supervisor, you have a director and a DP who aren't as familiar with how this app is working, and maybe are even less familiar with the whole VFX pipeline and what they're seeing within the app versus what you're going to get once it actually properly goes through all of your, render and comp. That's when there's suddenly a lot more pinch points because there's a lot more communication you need to do. There's a lot of potentially miscommunications. There's a lot of expectation setting and stuff. And that kind of bogs down the process. So the other reason why I think it folded into my workflow really nicely is because I was doing everything. So it just kind of like, I didn't have to explain to somebody what a material preview of a scene was and what you're seeing and what it's going to look like, because I already knew that. If I had to explain that to another director without VFX experience, they might look at that and go, what the bleep am I looking at? And so that those are kind of some things that I guess could definitely be improved to make it more helpful for bigger teams that might be wary of what they're seeing without knowing what they're going to be able to get at the end.
Having said that, I mean, that's the case in VFX anyway. I mean, very often, they will do the shoot, they'll do an edit, and they'll send it and they'll get an anim play blast, and that anim play blast will basically be a material preview, or even just a grey version of the CG. I mean, slowly, some directors will say, "No, I want a render just to see it," depending on how big a budget they have and how much leeway they have. But generally speaking, that those conversations have to happen anyway. Obviously, presumably in post, you do have a little bit more time to have someone have those conversations, whereas on set, there is no time if they're freaking out looking at this material preview. But I mean, that is, I think, what VFX supervision is, a lot of it is about. It's just trust. Like we can make stuff look good. The previews will look a bit janky. That is there to help you. That is not the final result, and trust the process. And that's as important as actually, well, one, you need a technical skill to actually, for them to actually be able to trust that you can actually do it. But two, you do need to be able to present that, Obviously, if you're doing it yourself, I mean, you just have to have faith in yourself that you're going to be able to fix it. So brilliant. Okay. So where can people find you online, or if they want to get in touch or see your work, where can they go to find that?
Yeah, if you want to watch like tidbits and bites and also like all of the breakdown videos, my YouTube channel is like Alden Peters 1. If you just Google Alden Peters in YouTube, it should hopefully pop up. And there's like a playlist there with the episodes, a playlist with the behind the scenes. Then the episodes are within those behind the scenes. There's also, you could find Friends of Sophia there, other work as well. Instagram at Alden Peters, TikTok, Alden.Peters. And yeah, if you want to reach out, I think my email address is on both my website and my YouTube channel. But if you want to DM me on one of those apps or something too, that works as well. But definitely reach out and let me know your thoughts.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. See you soon.